I'm not scared of dying. At the most, I'm scared of living too long where I can't decide for myself what I want to do about things.
Chuck Jackson has early onset Alzheimer's. At 53, he can no longer work and spends most of his day at his home in Albany, Oregon.
So some days I have really good days where I can talk really well and everything I do has a good flow to it. And other times there's just, I can't think straight enough to get off the couch.
More than 200,000 Americans now have early onset Alzheimer's, which can strike as young as the mid-40s. Scientists aren't sure what causes the disease in most people, but Chuck's case is unique. His family has a rare genetic mutation that almost always triggers the disease.
He had Alzheimer's. She had Alzheimer's. He had Alzheimer's later in life. He had Alzheimer's. My mother had Alzheimer's.
Of his mother's generation, 10 of 14 siblings had Alzheimer's, most of it early onset. And when Chuck was only 14, he was forced to nurse his mother as she wasted away.
She ran away from the house, took off her clothes, and she crawled into a culvert. And I had to pull her out of that, get her clothes on before any of the neighbors saw. She wanted to die then. Instead of praying for a cure, I started praying for a death. And there's a lot of guilt that comes from that at some point, to think that you'd prefer someone to die rather than continue to go through that kind of anguish and pain. There's some of us that are saying, we don't want to take this anymore, we want to do something about it, it's got to be stopped.
And that's where Chuck's unusual DNA comes in. A small group of scientists believes his unbelievably rare genes may hint at a new strategy for battling Alzheimer's.
You should learn a lot about the common disease by studying the rare disease.
But first, you need to hear the story of how scientists found Chuck in the first place. The tale is a medical mystery spanning 2 continents and 200 years, and both Chuck's DNA and our current understanding of Alzheimer's are at the center of it.
There was a real detective mystery kind of piece to it, yeah, sort of a genetic detective novel, if you will.
Dr. Thomas Bird is a researcher at the VA hospital in Seattle. In the late 1970s, when most scientists were looking for environmental causes for Alzheimer's, Dr. Bird went hunting for genes.
And at that point, no genes had been found for any human diseases. So the idea that Alzheimer's might be genetic and that we might be able to find the genes for it was kind of a shot in the dark.
At the time, the task seemed nearly impossible, but Dr. Bird got a lucky break.
And I was sitting in the living room in this farmhouse in Oklahoma chatting with the wife whose husband had died with Alzheimer's disease. And I asked her what was the family ethnic background. And she smiled and she said, well, my husband's family came from Russia, but they weren't Russians. She said they had all settled in these villages along the Volga River, and they often referred to themselves as Volga Germans. And a light bulb literally went off in my head, because back here in Seattle, we had had 2 other families that had given me that same story.
The woman who told Dr. Bird that story was Chuck's Aunt Esther. Her husband, who died of Alzheimer's, his Uncle Ralph. Back in Seattle, Dr. Bird began hunting down other Volga Germans that might have had Alzheimer's running in their families.
And we have your mother as having onset in her late 40s.
This is Jeff Brooks. Though they don't know each other, he and Chuck Jackson are distant cousins. Jeff's mother had early onset Alzheimer's. Jeff does not.
Similar is that all the ones that have the Alzheimer's disease, the genetic Alzheimer's disease, came from the same 2 villages. So we think they were all related to each other.
Dr. Bird's team spent 5 years analyzing their DNA and came to a startling discovery.
They all essentially had this exact same mutation, and at number 1, it confirmed the hypothesis that they were all related and they all had the same disease, and it was the discovery of a gene that caused Alzheimer's disease.
The mutation is unbelievably rare. Of the more than 2 million Volga Germans living here, there are less than 200 cases. But the discovery of this gene and 2 other Alzheimer's genes found elsewhere shed important light on how the disease may attack the brain.
We've learned that genetics is important, and we've learned that the proteins that these genes control are important.
That protein is amyloid beta, and for Alzheimer's patients, the chemical collects as toxic plaques in the brain. With Chuck's DNA, that process is in overdrive and gives researchers a target to slow down the disease.
Now we have something we can go after. We've got targets. We've got protein biochemical targets. And you didn't have that 20 years ago. So it's a huge step forward. That's not to say that any of the manipulations of those have yet cured the disease. They haven't. But the fact that you've got targets and that you can think about ways to manipulate them that might treat the disease is, in my mind, a huge step forward.
This next block, it's going to be to our left.
Not content to sit at home and wait for the illness, Chuck and his daughter Rachel go to Washington to push Congress for research money in a bill that would protect his daughter from genetic discrimination if she tests positive for Alzheimer's.
Genetic non-discrimination. It's where medical information can't be used against you.
Right.
Yeah.
You think we can get it passed this year?
I think so.
Stay right down there. Nice to see you.
Rachel has not yet taken the genetic test for Alzheimer's. She fears being turned down for insurance.
Well, I've been told you know why we're here.
I do. Yeah, we're supporting the bill too.
I brought information. We need that genetics protected, which you've been telling me is we're working on.
It's talking about the Snow bill, the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act that has passed the Senate. I think it's in the House, and it should pass the House this year. In the past, the Republicans have held it up.
Well, I voted for it.
Yeah, you
I know.
supported it.
And we care about this cause, and we will continue trying to influence colleagues to make sure that this goes forward.
Well, the whole thing is that this other generation's coming up behind us.
Yeah.
And I'd like it to end there. I'd like it to end before she even has to even think about having the genetic testing, you know?
And we'll do our part.
But that's my afternoon bills. Anacept, Namenda, no Anacept. Razidine, Namenda, alpha lipoic acid. I don't know. I'm losing it.
At day's end, Chuck breaks down recalling his own battle to get tested for a disease without a cure.
When I went for that test, it was against your mother's wishes, and she was very mad at me because she didn't want me to get it because of her fear. And I said, I want to know so I can tell Rachel if I don't have it, she doesn't have to worry about it. And if I do have it, I can make plans for the future because this is my life, not yours anymore. And I think it was the beginning of our end of our marriage.
Back in Seattle, Dr. Bird and his team are still hunting through Chuck's DNA, for it contains one last vital mystery.
There are some people in these families who develop the disease in their 40s. There are other people in the families with the same mutation, the same disease, and they don't develop it until they're in their 70s. Why is that? What factors are controlling this variability in age of onset? If you could find factors, genetic or environmental, that prevent Alzheimer's from developing for 20 or 30 years, you've got a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. You've got something that could really impact this disease. And so to find those factors is quite important.
But for Chuck, there won't be enough time.
It's a 1967 Dodge Charger. I just couldn't follow like a diagram or I started having problems figuring out what my tools were for at times.
After a lifetime of rebuilding classic cars, Chuck couldn't finish this one.
I know someday I won't be able to talk as well as I'm doing right now, and I'm not talking as well as I did 3 years ago. So I wanted to say all of this now, for by the time when the big silence comes for me, people will know who I was with this disease. So thank you for listening to me and looking at my car.
After 5 years of separation, Chuck's ex-wife, Marianne, asked him to come back home so she could care for him.
I really care about Chuck. I love Chuck. I guess I just felt it was the right thing to do.
It's more fun than fishing. We're not going quietly to our grave with this disease. We're going to talk about it. And that's hopefully going to bring action. If not for me, at least it should bring some action for my daughter and the other children who are following other people with early onset.